I wanted to talk briefly about rules versus boundaries. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to define a rule as something that you're meant to do, and it's a bad situation and represents bad behavior on your part if someone has to actually cause some kind of punishment to you to make you do it. A boundary would be something where you say, if you cross this line, I will do this. To be an effective boundary, it has to be actionable. You have to be able to do something about it. And when you're dealing in an assertive framework with other people, your options are pretty much limited to the ultimatum of terminating the relationship. If you want to prefer different definitions of rules and boundaries, that's fine, but that's not the definition I'm using, so talking according to your definition is not going to be helpful. My basic argument is that rules are actually far more useful the more cooperative a relationship is. And boundaries only become necessary when cooperation is low. And if you use boundaries, or as I call them, ultimatums, in a situation where cooperation would otherwise be high, you sabotage the relationship that you're in. So let me take the example of romantic relationships. There's a very common idea out there these days that a relationship is something where you've basically got the two options, which is to put up with what's going on or leave. And people are very, very keen on the leaving these days. And I'm not sure why we would want to encourage an ethos where your only options in a relationship are to put up with whatever's happening and thereby effectively have no boundary regardless of what you say, or to leave the relationship. That's just a recipe for bad relationships and ended relationships. And there's a huge aspect of life which is compromise and loyalty and things like that that's not really covered. And it is covered by the idea of rules. That's why we have rules, so we can get on with each other. It's so that even though a person doesn't want to do something and hasn't been given an ultimatum about what will happen, they will still go along with it. And they might not like it, but it's better than the alternative of an aggressive ultimatum, like someone just coming out of the blue in a relationship and saying, if you don't do this, or if you do this, then I'm going to leave, or you're going to have to leave. Any power you have over the person suddenly is immediately the club you wield for every problem, if you're going to deal with it at all. And the alternative, of course, is to pretend this isn't the case and be incredibly passive-aggressive and have wheedling conversations with no punch to them because you're unwilling to say, like, I want it to be a rule that you don't do this or that you do this. And instead try and convince the other person that they should do the thing that they disagree about, or not do the thing they disagree about, or failing that, leave the relationship. And this is not just romantic relationships, this is any kind of relationship. It could be professional, it could be any kind of domestic relationship, I guess, where you've got the option of leaving or kicking the other person out, or friendships. So my advice that no one asked for is that you should embrace the idea of rules, according to my definition of rules, not whatever one you want to use to strawman what I'm saying. But the idea of things that you're meant to do, even if you're not going to be punished for not doing them, or not meant to do even though you're not going to be punished for doing them, that has huge value in any cooperative relationship. It's how people get on in relationships that are functioning well. And it's kind of tragic to take the pathological case where one person just will not follow rules, where you need boundaries or ultimatums, where you need to leave the relationship, which are the tiny minority of situations, and say, oh well, because it's needed in pathological situations, then it should be the rule of how we teach people to approach relationships. I don't think it should be that way. I've seen firsthand just today, someone I know was telling me about a recent situation in which someone used a ultimatum boundary rather than even requesting that he stop doing what he was doing, rather than having it be a conversation or a negotiation or even setting a rule. It was straight to boundaries, straight to, you're going to be kicked out if you do that again. And regardless of what that person thought was common sense, which isn't a thing, anything that you know or think you know is considered common sense to you, but is not actually necessarily in any way common, or everyone else would also see it that way. But I digress. It would be much better if the person was willing to have the kind of rule where they say, well, this is the kind of behavior I want, this is the kind of behavior I expect from you. And just let the person deal with that, how they're going to deal with that. You're putting social pressure on the person, but not threatening them. You know, the difference is huge, because the person can still be secure in the relationship and not be chafing under the restrictions that have been placed on them, not be as resentful. You know, if someone says that they expect something else from you, you might be a little bit huffy and resentful about it, but nowhere near as resentful as you're going to be if the person just suddenly launches an ultimatum at you. You're going to be kicked out if you don't do what I want. So I think the well-intentioned and sometimes, well, the well-intentioned idea that I think is sometimes just a difference in how you define these words. Like, I think a lot of, psychologists and a lot of reasonable people would agree with me and just be using the terms differently. Like, they'll be using the term boundary when what they're actually expressing is a wish, which is not really a boundary. And they'll use the term rule when what they mean is like, an enforced law or an ultimatum, which I don't think really captures the spirit of what a rule is. But in any case, whatever you call the different terms, what I'm calling a rule is clearly the best way of approaching any lasting cooperative relationship. And only if the other person is incredibly unwilling to cooperate should you even be considering setting boundaries to the person, because that can very often be aggressive or passive aggressive and destructive, and assertiveness requires that you be able to state your position without trying to force the other person to do things they have the right not to do. And just leaving the relationship it's like the worst thing you can do for a relationship, unless the relationship is incredibly pathological.